Well, hello and welcome to everybody. My name is Olivier Renaud-Clément. I organized the François Morellet exhibition at Hauser and Wirth. This is our first. It is open until April 7th by reservation, and we hope a lot of you can visit the exhibition until then and after you make an appointment. Meanwhile, we have prepared a small video presentation of the exhibition for those who haven't seen the show and those who cannot see the show. You will see this in a minute. And I want to mention that the exhibition was titled Incoherent, which is an indirect homage to an exhibition of the same name that took place starting in 1882, and an homage also to Alphonse Allais. And this is a way, sort of way to create a pun and highlight the humorous quality of François Morellet's art and the fact that this exhibition also has no coherence in its assemblage. So I invite you to look at our presentation now. Welcome back, and I would like to welcome two major figures for this webinar today, and for what we hope will be a somewhat incoherent encounter. A famed art historian, and professor emeritus and writer Yve-Alain Bois, who's a specialist of Mondrian, Ellsworth Kelly, and François Morellet, amongst others, and Kenneth Goldsmith, the visionary web creator and founder of UbuWeb, which is a unique web platform dedicated to most things artistic, poetic, performative, philosophical, or without any specific purpose. Kenneth is the recipient of the 2020 François Morellet Award, and I'm happy to welcome you here. Before we start, audience that they can submit their comments or questions, and we will have a few minutes at the end of this encounter to answer some of the questions. As a starter, so welcome to both of you. As a starter, may I propose we play a sort of hide and seek game in trying to unveil the many aspects of Morellet's spirit and semantics. I don't know who wants to start with this thought.
What does that mean, hide and seek?
Well, you know, you will have, both of you will have a different background, and I think you will bring to the conversation different aspects or thoughts on the work of François Morellet. So that's why I'm, you know,
okay.
We have a very strong academic on my left and a more poetic approach on my right.
Okay.
So let's see how you play that game.
Okay. Well, I'll since I'm here, I'll take it. Morellet is a really funny artist. It doesn't look like it's funny, but it's, you know, it's hysterical, and intentionally so. I love how things don't fall together. I think the title of the show is perfect, Incoherent, a perfect and purposeful incoherence that he's trying to do in his own work. There are all sorts of things that don't fit together right in the show, that almost feel broken in this show, that are almost like he's working in a heroic form in an anti-heroic way. And I think that, to me, this feels extraordinarily contemporary. There's a sort of beautiful intentional weakness in the work that seems to go against the reputation of conceptual art, at least as it's been passed down, though I believe there are some moments of tenderness in conceptual art, but they're publicly few and far between. I think this work is extraordinarily tender. I think it's extraordinarily poetic, and beyond that, in its programmatics, it actually is pre-internet. I believe that this work and many of Morellet's statements anticipates a machinic, an algorithmic, an artificial intelligence approach, a pro artificial intelligence approach to making art. Now, you could say that about a lot of conceptual art, because, but I think that Morellet actually got out there in the early 60s and started talking about machines, not in a way that Warhol did, where he said, I want to be a machine, but actually I want to be like a machine. And I think that's like two very different phrases. So, and finally, and then I'll let Yve-Alain say something. I think finally, there's a great connection with a certain strain of 20th century poetry that runs through the work of Morellet, beginning with the 1950s, where he emerges as a concrete artist with concrete poetry, moving through into the 70s, where a lot of Morellet's ideas are realized with the French Oulipo group of writers, and finally into today's digital world, where digital poetics and conceptual writing relate directly back to Morellet in all these aspects. So that alone is a lot to talk about, but yeah, that's my kind of poetic take on him.
Well, I could pick up and speak about Morellet's humor, which is pervasive through his work, not completely at the beginning. I think humor comes the decision to present his work in a humoristic way and to do work which are funny, I think, come probably around the end of the 50s, even though he had done some of the works like that before, but he was not presenting them this in a humoristic way. It was more a kind of typical Max Biel, concrete Kunst, seriousness until that time. But when the moment he starts to involve chance in his systems of producing art, then humor comes along very well. And he kept this, and he got more and more funny. In fact, over the years, his titles or the titles of the work are always kind of ironic, even though they are very plain. They are very plain. They just tell you how work has been made by give you the angles and whatever. But there's an irony in the way it's stated, and he constantly played with language in many statements that he wrote. I'll mention the collection of his writing is published in French as commentaires mes commentaires. So the first syllables and the last syllables, the first three syllables and the last three syllables of the title are the same, but it's, of course, they don't mean the same, because commentaires mes commentaires should be translated as but how to, mais comment, silence, taire, mes commentaires, my comments. So how to silence my comments gives mes commentaires in French. It's typical of the type of things that Morellet will do with words, which in a way, in this kind of permutational, conceptual language, is very much related to what he does with his art itself, which is very often based on permutations. I'll give you another example of the way in which Morellet constantly makes some kind of like gentle fun about himself and about his past in the tradition of the geometric abstraction. In 2005, or I don't know, he made an exhibition at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, and the title was Quand j'étais petit, je ne faisais pas grand, which can be translated as when I was small, I didn't look very tall, or when I was small, I was producing small works. And the show itself was a combination of works from the early 50s. And here you should show the slide G. Works from the early 50s, which were present in a kind of, you could see them in a kind of like a staccato presentation, perpendicular to the viewer. And then on the background, you would have the same work multiplied by 10 or 20. I can't remember the ratio, so that it would look like a Frank Stella or whatever. So the entire show was a kind of response to the his own commentary to a various discourse, which was that, oh, but he did it before Sol-Lewitt, oh, he did it before Frank Stella, to which Morellet, of course, agreed. But at the same time, he showed that he was aware of the fact that doing a small thing of, 2 feet wide is not the same thing as doing something 20 feet wide. So, it was he was trying to not look like this, complaining artist that has been ignored by historians, but at the same time, acknowledging that he did things early and they should be taken into consideration.
So you've approached a lot of things here. I mean, how do we view his legacy? In other words, he's impressed, he meets Max Biel and is impressed by this kind of work, and he becomes the first incarnation of himself, François Morellet, and then he moves away from that, but he keeps being referred to these people and this kind of movement. How do you find, I find him to be a very free person, a very free artist. However, even today, when you handle the work or you show the work, you keep mentioning this reference. Is there some sort of misconception of who Morellet really is, which is his own artist and his own man with his own trajectory?
Well, I think he had many different trends coming into his work, and he never repudiated anything. So he never said, I'm going to declare war to Max Biel, not at all. But he, changed his attitude, and it was never no more this kind of gospel of science and art and mathematics and all that govern everything. But it was also adding a kind of element of Dadaistic, humor and other traits that were completely contradictory to the Max Biel gospel. So he kept expanding rather than, he did not eliminate things from his pedigree, but he kept like displacing it by augmenting it with other reference and other ways to look at art. One of the things that struck me when I was trying to some years ago to assemble a collection of essays to publish in English, and it was very hard to find texts that were not specific. That is, every time he made an exhibition, and which is often when he wrote about what he was doing, he was specifically describing how he made such a work, on what was the process by which he had made such a work. He wanted things to be totally transparent, that you could basically redo it yourself. And even you have already that in these titles, but you have to know a little bit how to interpret the title. So it was, what was very, very interesting is that he didn't have a general theory of things. It was always extremely specific. And that thing is typical of Morellet, that he would have this kind of openness and this emphasis on the real stuff or the real object, the way it has its own specific system and so forth. And you don't need to go into grand theory to explain what you're doing. And so it was hard to find texts that would not have necessitated a truckload of illustrations, which of course I couldn't do. It was for the Journal of October. I did find some, but it was hard to select some, in his rather huge mass of writing, to find some that did not necessitate a huge amount of images.
I have a question. In that kind of programmatics, actually the recipe for making the art, which, as you said, is often in his titles, then how does that differ from a programmatic recipe artist like Sol LeWitt, in your opinion?
Oh, in that account, it's the same. That's one of the things they have in common. They have several things in common, but of course the difference are key. But this is something they have, like, it's not all Sol LeWitt. Sol LeWitt of the early wall drawings, where he explained exactly, you know, the angles and the measurements and all that. That's very similar to what Morellet did, except that it's true for that particular case. It is true that Morellet started to do that way before Sol LeWitt. But on that account, they are the same in my mind.
So to your knowledge, did anybody ever take him up on that and actually go make their own Morellet, authorized or unauthorized, based on those?
I don't know about that. I don't know. I'm not sure what he would have said. He would probably have
Probably
joked.
would be very amused by that. No, don't you think he would encourage it?
He would have felt, yeah, he would have made some remark, probably said that he was very proud or very, you know.
Well, in the work of his that we saw in the slideshow, it's called, I'm sorry, I'm looking here, Trams 387, 93, 183. This big grid that was on the side of the building next to the Dia for his retrospective. The great thing about that was that he closed his eyes and tried to draw parallel lines, and then use that as the template for a major amount of work. So, you know, this is something I could never see Sol LeWitt closing his eyes to make a drawing. There's something so poetic and so beautiful and so weird about that I can't imagine some American conceptualist doing that in the same way.
Yeah.
And also there was also that other funny piece in the Dia, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's a pan of black water on the floor, and above it is suspended a grid of neon. Yeah. And when the water is still, the grid is absolutely perfect, but they have a little stick there that you're encouraged to go and move the water around, and suddenly the grid is all over the place and completely messed up. I mean, it was the funniest thing in the world. It's like how to destroy the sanctity of minimalism and conceptualism. Please destroy it. It's more truthful. And also it's in that piece, none of the grids are ever the same. When the thing's moving, there's some very funny shots in the catalog from the Dia show of those. And of course, every grid is a different grid because the water is always making a different pattern. I mean, that's very funny. And again, those sort of things remind me of animated GIFs. I keep coming back to GIFs when I think of Morellet. I think of a lot of his grids as being precursors to the form of a GIF called an interlaced GIF. When the web was in its nascency, there wasn't enough bandwidth to send in a full image. So images would come in sort of alternating lines, like a Venetian blind, very, very slowly and fill themselves in a predictable, systematic, but also poetic way, because odd bits of the image would become visible long before other parts would be. So again, this kind of thing where you could almost put it back together, take it apart, it would come in, it would fill in, it was wrong, it was glitchy, it was dithery. I mean, these are all the kind of things, like the glitch is something that I think Morellet absolutely loved and played with. And I guess the only other, like the kind of media art that I can think of from that time that played with the glitch would have been somebody like Nam June Paik, who loved glitches and errors. And, you know, his famous piece with the television and the horseshoe magnet on the top, that simply by turning the horseshoe magnet, the image would waver differently. This is exactly the same thing as Morellet was doing with the grid and the water.
Except his technology was low key.
It was, but it was the same idea. It was like mess up, destabilize what is considered to be stable technology. The grid is the most stable of our technologies. You know, our cities are built on grids. Television is you know, apparently a miraculous stable technology at that point. And both artists invite you to destroy the stability of stable media and turn it unstable, which I think incoherent, instability, these are really valuable, kind of precarious and precious, and I'd even say, back again, the tender side of the internet.
No, I think, I mean, there's a lot of
So
stuff.
we were talking before we were on.
What?
No, go ahead, Yve-Alain.
No, I agree that there's a lot of things that Morellet did that anticipate or possibilities offered by the internet, but on the other way, he's also a bit of a Luddite. You know, I mean, he's remained extraordinarily traditional in terms of his own technical apparatus. I mean, you know, the reason he stopped painting this series of 40,000 squares is because it took his family a year to make it, and so he said that's enough. But
that was also a programmatic gesture where his family were calling out phone numbers,
yes.
and that was where he would place the pieces. So he was actually creating a programmatic situation, and a programmatic sort of a grid in which to fill in. And I think that he says in 1962, and there's really incredible quotes. He says that a genuine experiment must be carried out on the basis of verifiable components, progressing systematically and following a program. You see, I think the best internet artists are the ones that work in an analog way. The worst ones are net artists, let's say, you know, who have all the technology at their hand but have no ideas. You see, in this way, I think that Morellet really predicts the web in it doesn't really matter if he's working online or offline. He's not Nam June Paik, obviously. He's very lo-fi. But I would say that about the types of writing, you know, sometimes people have too much ammunition. And I think one thing I also love about Morellet is the sort of dumbness of the work, you know, and that's
that's something he absolutely espoused, you know, and in many texts actually, that he doesn't trust artists with too many ideas and all kind of thing, and you have to be dumbness is part of the qualities.
This is the province of art. This is why art is so great. Art is the only place that actually allows you to be intentionally dumb. I call it smart dumb, right? You intentionally decide to do the stupid thing and it changes the world. What's stupider than putting, turning a urinal on its side and putting it on a pedestal? But it's so profound because it's something that somebody really smart would never think to do, because they'd say, aha, that's too dumb, or aha, my kid could do that, you know. So the artist then occupies that territory of making the dumb move the smartest move you can possibly be. And I think beside the word tenderness in this conversation, I sort of want to throw into the ring the word perverse. You know, that's a perverse move. You know, most culture cannot handle contradiction, sort of perversity, but art in a funny way says, do the stupid thing, and it'll blow your mind. And you think really almost all so many of the great de-skilled artworks of the 20th and even 21st century, even thinking of like Rikrit Tiravana's cooking curry. What a stupid idea. Wow, that's a mind-blowing idea. So I think that Morellet is really on that in his own way, predicting it in the 50s, where, you know, in the 60s, people start to get more involved with those sort of stupid ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing to say.
Well, can we have all the slides now?
There we go.
Okay, this is a slide. Oh, this is a slide that it's one of his work called Deux Trames, with two networks, and it's made with simply two different grids of little dashes. And it's quite startling when you see it, because you try to find, you know, written that. And in fact, next slide, the slide that goes with it, the next one, which is, yeah, This is a page of a scheme that he made for a catalogue in Baden-Baden, I think, in the 70s, in which he was explaining a little bit in a kind of pedagogical way, which he afterwards made fun of himself for having done that, but how he did his work. And it shows like the 0 degree, 14 degree, two different things are what's combined to make the painting I just showed before. So it was like, you can produce extraordinary, surprising things visually by the simplest means. That was one of the motto of his entire work, all his life. You can produce very, very dazzling effects, optical, visual effects, by the simplest, the dumbest possible things.
Ah, dumb. But I have a question for you. So how would this little recipe here, again, I want to go back to Lewitt, differ from the sort of wild patterns that he derived from similar things? Lewitt would never show you the menu this way or show you how it's assembled, correct? He'd just give a verbal statement.
No, he did. On some of the early wall designs, you would have a little drawing explaining the way things were made, but early ones, not later. You would have, something quite similar, which would be drawn on a portion of the wall next to the wall drawing. That's it did for quite, and then it stopped because he transformed his wall drawing into something that has nothing to do with that, and which kind of dialogue with the Quattrocento and Piero della Francesca and God knows what. But the beginning of solid wall drawing, he had this kind of like, there's a caption, and the caption contains the diagram showing how the drawing was produced. But that's for a relatively short moment, I admit. But
this is what I would call, like, step by step, I would call it progressive, right? A progressive piece. And I want to say that word progressive comes in again into web vocabulary with the way that our own images are loaded onto the web. They are loaded in the similar logical progression, which, like this exact piece, ends up with an image. Now, this thing is basically the way our entire internet is working. What you're looking at here is a map of the internet. Yve-Alain, would it be all right if I showed a digital cognate?
Go. Sure.
If we could pull up on my presentation the number 4 slide, please. Okay, and if you can just play it, there you go. So this is called a progressive, or it's related to an interlaced GIF that actually begins to fill itself in slowly in order to create this image, one after another. Now, if you look at the early pieces, the early permutation of this, the first or second frame of this looks like an early Morellet piece right there. Okay, now this is very funny. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is a really great piece that I found on the web. This is a student, and he says that his quote, this guy is named Max Halford. He says, "These days I'm working on a deep learning project. I hated it, but I promised myself to give it a real try. The scripts are taking a long time, so I decided to do some procedural art while I waited. This time I'm going to reproduce the following crosses made by François Morellet. I saw them the last time I went to the Musée Pompidou with some friends from university." Okay, so this is absolutely incredible. If you go to the next slide, you can see this is the guy's program, and he goes really into depth on his GitHub page on how to make this. Of course, I don't quite understand all of this stuff, but hit the next slide, please. And then he actually begins to recreate these Morellet things very accurately. Next. And then once he has that, he begins to line them all up on a grid in order to make the grid that Morellet's piece is actually on, putting the colors in exactly in the same place. This is not Photoshop, by the way. This is all done with language, programming language, which I think is remarkable. So in a sense, he's writing. This is a poem that's manifesting itself as visuality. Next slide, please. And then they begin to interlock in this beautiful way, just like that progressive GIF that I was telling you about, that I showed you with the Hello Kitty earlier. Next, please. And there, voila. And next slide. There you go. He reproduced it exactly to the exact color, all using language. Okay. Again, it wasn't drawn. It wasn't, you know, what it was all programmed in Photoshop. So to me, this is really, really the legacy of Morellet. And the fact that this guy, this young programmer, would actually choose the Morellet to reproduce says to me that this is exactly predictive of our digital situation right now.
So I guess thanks to you, Kenneth, I think we've discovered who we need to address this show to and to invite to the gallery.
Well, I mean, I found with my students that they really hate everything until I can relate it somehow to the internet. You know, for example, I was showing them situationist films that were resubtitled, and they really didn't like them until we looked at something like the Hitler bunker meme, in which Bruno Ganz is playing Hitler, is constantly being recycled and recaptioned for whatever event is happening in the world. And then you go back to the René Vianney films, situationist films, they go, oh, that's exactly what he's doing. He's putting Marxist subtitles about wage slavery and unfair labor practices on top of a Japanese porn film. You know, and say, oh, okay, suddenly I understand it. So I think, Olivier, we're getting at the reason there's no giant audience yet for Morellet, because I think the audience has not actually discovered Morellet in terms of people who are living on the web. But this brings me to another point, which I'd really like to get into, because I know we don't have a lot of time here, but there does seem to be a lack of an audience in the United States for this kind of stuff, and for Morellet's stuff, but maybe French art in general. I mean, this guy had a major retrospective at the Dia, right? Now, if that's not a career maker, having the works jump off the wall and go up in price, I don't know what is. It would seem from the American point of view that this guy would be canonized here. But I think that my impression was that the Dia show was really rather low key. The Hauser Wirth show, you know, when we were up there, we were the only people in the gallery. I'm wondering about the reception for this work. It's kind of not happening as it should in let's say in New York. That much I know. But then if we widen the lens a little bit, perhaps there's a problem with French art and the reception of French contemporary art in New York. And I'd like to hear your feelings about that.
Well, I don't know. You know, Olivier, maybe you want to say. I mean, it's not the first time that Morellet is presented in America, and it's not, you know, widely received. There was a show organized by Jan van der Mark in 1985, which toured, I don't think, something like started at Albright Knox, but that toured, I think, like 10 American museums, and it was like a flop. So I think French art in particular is something difficult for Americans. It's a long story. I think we have to go back to Serge Guibaud's book and How New York Stole the Market of Modern Art, or the title like that. And I think there's, you know, this I think by the late 50s, with several onslaught by the American criticism against what was made in France. You know, Greenberg, for example, at that time was powerful, and he never spent a minute to criticize, you know, the cuteness and the lack of force of French art and whatever. So I think there was a kind of disaffection, turning away from Paris and all that. And I think we, in many ways, are still probably might be changing, but we for a long time were like that. In the situation of you know, now the ball is in our camp, and too bad for you guys. But I think on Morellet in particular, he's hard to pin down. You know, he's hard to get catalogue, and the market likes artists that are easy to frame. You know, he comes from let's say from the concrete art movement of Max Biel, but he does something that swerves away without completely breaking with it. He's hard to. He has many directions. He's a multimedia artist in many ways. He often does installations that require, you know, that are site specific way before the term was invented. And so what you do with that. I think that he's a little too complex for an easy acceptance by a market who doesn't know much about the situation from which he comes from.
I mean, I would just put out there that somebody like Naumann is as wide-ranging, unidentifiable, and complex, and yet he's a superstar.
Yeah, but
he's the perfect American male also.
Yeah, also it started, you know, Morellet started painting, you know, started his, you know, some of his early work, like the painting I wanted to show, which maybe we can show now, from 1952. You know, it's Naumann was what, in diapers at the time, so it's not the same generation.
Well, there it is.
Yeah, no, that was not the one I wanted. I wanted one G.
That's a beautiful one, though.
Yeah, this is a work that he showed, which he showed an aggrandizement to 20 feet. So he showed both a small work and a work expanded in this. He made that for about 20 works in that show. And, you know, this is 1952, and it's, you know, it has already a lot of the components of Morellet's, you know, notion of the system that you start using and all that. So, you know, it's not the same generation as Naumann, and Naumann, as you know, was launched you know, as an American artist for the American market. So it's a different genealogy, let's say.
And Olivier, French art, you've just told me that French art, you know, contemporary art in general, doesn't get a good reception here.
Well, I think we've seen a bit of a change here. Recently, I mean, obviously after the war, we know what happened, and the Americans came full speed after the war, and with the American expressionist and all the rest that follows. So the French kind of disappeared in the action, so to speak. But I find that people of my generation seem to find a better voice on the international platform, both by response of museum, but also by the market. And I will, you know, I can only name a few, such as Pierre Huyghe or Henri Salat, for example, which are artists that are widely recognized today, that have a strong place in the market, and that also a large audience is willing to accept. That would be the same for Philippe Parreno. They're people of my generation with a different language, of course, but some of them deriving directly from Morellet, or people that have looked at the work. That would be the case with Philippe Parreno, I believe, who works with a certain idea of systems as well. But it has been difficult, or there's been moments where fashion took over, and that was the case of Christian Boltanski in the late 80s, and mostly because he found a huge success in America, because he was addressing the Jewish community very directly by the work he was making. And I think he had attention, but eventually that attention passed and the market collapsed. I mean, Christian Boltanski doesn't have such a huge audience and market in America at this point. So what we're doing is also trying to, you know, open the door to this kind of position and show people that it's not a nationality that makes an artist, but the work itself. But it's a very long process to be recognized and accepted by the audience and the museum and the collectors.
There's also the case with Morellet that because he comes from this tradition which he perverted, as Kenneth said, of the geometric abstraction, it's you know, this is not a tradition that has continued, you know, that has been that has a lot of fan over the years in America. It's only today, for example, that people are looking back at something like Albers. For years, Albers was basically, you know, almost you know, completely forgotten. So the tradition of geometric abstraction did not really ripple very well in America for many years. And so Morellet comes from that. He changed that. He skewed it, but still, that I think it takes a while for people to appreciate what he did to the tradition, tradition, if you don't know much about it.
Well, here's how that kind of squares with what's going on online. Say, because all music is now available, right, on streaming services like Spotify, suddenly no music is forgotten. You know, they always say the internet has the longest memory of all. You know, no music is forgotten. So every music, every style of music is now contemporary. So you have bands coming out and doing sort of the best 1970s prog rock record in 2020, much better in a sense, or disco records from the 70s, much better now than when they were actually made. Almost every single genre, you can say this about music. And in a funny way, like maybe the revival of some of this stuff, you know, keeping it contemporary is its circulation online. You know, and so for a lot of people, I think like really the future for a lot of work is that if it isn't online, it doesn't exist. You know, people, you know, particularly when I work around UberWeb, people want to control what's out there and what's not. And I have to say to them, I have to say, look, if you actually remove this from the UberWeb archive, for some significant portion of a population won't care or won't know about your work. So in a sense, I think that Perino and those guys are relational work emerges when the internet emerges in an analog space, but it's actually trying to form similar types of networks that would actually explode and keep all sorts of old-fashioned things relevant kind of forever. So I think, like, again, I think that the future of Morellet is actually yet to be found. And the more sort of circulation, I mean, this guy doing a programming thing is an absolutely beautiful way of keeping an artist's work who was in the hands of just a few, not that well known, in the hands of collectors, actually making it accessible and understandable and obtainable to another generation. Ta-da!
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I don't know. You guys stopped listening, but you know, maybe.
We were absorbed.
I was going on a little too long.
You are as magnetic as any given work by François Morellet.
I wanted to maybe we should wrap it up because we do have to take some questions. But I just also pulled up my favorite quote of Warhol because I really think it relates to something Morellet would say. And Warhol wrote this was from, I think it was from Popism, the necessity of bad transcription, working to make sure that the pages in the book matched the way the high school typist had transcribed them, right down to the last spelling mistake. I wanted to do a bad book, just the way I'd done bad movies and bad art, because when you do something exactly wrong, you always turn up something. And to me, that is exactly wrong. That's the most beautiful phrase, the most tender and beautiful and poetic phrase. And I think Morellet was exactly wrong.
I agree, I think, and in fact, it's interesting because he was interested in bad translations. he made exercise himself in bad translations for that precise reason. Mistakes given the rules, basically, or explaining the way language functions, and so
well,
forth.
I think that there's a truth in that, you know, and I think there's a relatableness to error. And maybe that's why he's not so Superman in the market, because he doesn't project super qualities that we all desire in our superstar artists. He's the antithesis of that, you know, but Warhol was too. And then of course, look at Warhol. So, I mean, Warhol wrote that quote, but everything he did bad was the best and is worth millions of dollars today. So go figure.
I mean, interestingly enough, Morellet is very successful in Europe, whether it's in Switzerland, Italy, Germany with huge collectors, and Belgium and France. So, I mean, at some stage or another, he had as many as 17 galleries representing him. So he was always very much in demand, and I think always ready to jump into any kinds of project as long as there was an element of to go forward. You know, he came to America every year, as you all know, and he had a constant dialogues with American artists and situation, but that did not help his recognition in America yet, although he's already in a lot of American collection. So
his future is to be a meme. I think the meme world is going to get all over him.
Okay, well, you start with UbuWeb.
No, that guy, that kid that did the programming already started.
No, I get it.
It's already out there. It's happening. So watch out. Hello Kitty mashups with Morellet. It's going to be great.
Totally. I wondered if there is any question yet. Let's see. Oh, question for us at this point.
Okay.
Go ahead,
So,
Kenneth.
I wanted to also maybe to conclude my spiel here, if we could go back to my presentation, please. And this is like this is such a funny piece. Like, it's a piece that doesn't fit. It's from 1992 called Steel Life. And, you know, he made all of these kind of things that don't go together, that kind of fall apart. And to me, this is an actual example of the shattered and contradictory nature of the web. To me, this is a sort of this befuddling mix of logic and nonsense, you know, which has its roots deep in 20th century modernism. You know, things not kind of lining up, not taking place. As a matter of fact, I often say that the modernist experiment was akin to a number of planes barreling down runways, you know, cubist planes, surrealist planes, abstract expressionist planes, each taking off and then crashing immediately, only to be followed by sort of another aborted takeoff, one after another. But what if, and I'm thinking about Morellet, instead we were able to imagine that these planes didn't crash at all, but instead sailed into our time, into the 21st century, finding full flight in the digital world. So what if the cubist airplane gave us the tools, like Morellet, to understand our shattered interfaces? This is a shattered interface, this piece. You know, or the surrealist airplanes kind of gave us the tools to frame the radical disjunction and bizarre humor of the web, or the abstract expressionist airplanes to theorize the all-over skein-like nature of our networks. So in a sense, the shattering, the things that don't make sense, the things that don't go together, are actually the root of the internet. If you can just go to the next slide, please. Like this one, this is the funniest piece in the world. Like, it doesn't fit. The line doesn't fit above the door. It's like, it's shattered. It's wrong. It's broken. I think it's a hysterical piece. This is from 1991. That's at the Pompidou. And finally, the last one, please, the next slide. These are hysterical. These, he calls them geometries, G-E-O-M.
This is your favorite, huh?
These are hysterical. They're broken. These, if you can't see, if you don't understand these pieces, they're all these very hard geometrical lines, but they're all connected with sticks. He was a gardener. He'd go out into his garden. And this is the kind of, this to me is the internet. If we could reconcile the shattered nature not reconcile our comfort with the fact that the internet will never be a united and whole experience, that in fact, the nature of the web is disjunctive, then I think we'd feel a lot better about all the time that we waste on the internet. So these to me are perfect illustrations of the web. Okay.
Well, you know, if you take that, it's also obviously a comment on the kind of not absurdity, but highfalutin way of abstract geometry, geometrical abstraction. I think that it's so. There's an aspect of Morellet's work which is always commenting about various moments of art history. For example, in the show, there is this series called Entre deux Mers, you know, which is basically a spoof on Romanticism and those, you know. You think of Caspar David Friedrich and this almost empty landscape with just the sea and the horizon, but it's called Entre deux Mers. Maybe we can have the slide. There are a series of 5, I think, diptychs with 2 paintings, 2 canvases side by side with the horizon, and the canvases themselves are tilted. So you have the kind of horizon of this represent the sea, and the lower part of the square is metal, which reflects, and it looks like it's a bit wobbly. And you know, entre deux mer is a wine, so of course the fact that the squares are tipped has to do with being tipsy and so forth. But it's also you know, both a commentary on geometric abstraction and on the tradition of the square and Malevich, and then Romanticism. So there's always this kind of compound of allusions to precedents in artistry that is part of Morellet's humor. And I think this is one of those, because it could be a comment on let's say on Malevich or any of the members of the suprematist group in 1920 Russia, but you know, transformed and perverted, as you say.
I also, it's also this piece that we're looking at, the geometries are like stoner art. It's like, you know, when you get really stoned and you go, oh, I wonder what would happen if we put this tree up against this and connected the lines. I mean, it's that sort of beauty and fragility and as you're saying, tipsiness. I think we could really make a case for alcohol and drugs in this work as well. Nothing quite adds up. I love you that you mentioned tipsiness. I don't think anybody's ever talked about Morellet and altered states of consciousness, but I feel it here. You know, but that's all, you know, that's the period. And it's also a lot of, you know, a lot of conceptual art is people sort of, I think in the 60s, people sitting around on drugs saying, what if, you know, which is so beautiful and possible. Oh, what if? Okay.
Well, thank you to both of you. I think you gave our audience a great reason to go see the show, and I hope many more people will come, even though it's a little difficult right now. Kenneth, thank you for your time. Yve-Alain, thank you for your time from Princeton, and we speak to you all very soon, and thank you to our audience as well.